A woman should always own something, something no man can take away.
Amara, listen to me, I can explain. It is not what you think.
You gave my mother's ring to her?
My husband gave my mother's heirloom ring to his side chick for her birthday. The first time I saw my mother's ring again after she died was not in my jewelry box where I had kept it safe for 6 years. It was on Instagram, wrapped around the finger of a woman I had never met, in a photograph captioned, "Birthday gift from the man who sees me." I recognized that ring before I even finished the caption. I recognized the small chip on the inner band, where my mother had once dropped it into a mortar while pounding yam. The tiny imperfection she always said gave the gold its character. My husband had taken my dead mother's ring out of our home and given it to another woman for her birthday. If you think you know where this story is going, stay with me, because what I discovered underneath that photograph was far darker than a simple case of a cheating husband. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why some family heirlooms carry more than gold. My name is Ngozi, and this is the story of the ring that exposed 2 generations of lies. I want you to understand what that ring meant to me before I tell you how I found it again. My mother, Mama Chidi Malkafo, wore that ring every single day of her adult life. A thin band of gold with a small, unassuming stone that she always said was worth more in memory than in market value. She gave it to me herself, 3 weeks before she died of complications from diabetes that we had fought for 11 years to manage. She placed it in my palm in her hospital bed at Loth and closed my fingers around it with both of her hands, already thin and cool by then, and told me that a woman should always own one thing in this world that no man gave her and no man could take away. I did not fully understand what she meant at the time. I understand it completely now, after everything that has happened. I married Emeka 2 years after my mother passed, in a wedding she never got to see, though I wore her ring on a chain around my neck throughout the entire ceremony, tucked beneath my wedding dress where only I knew it rested. We met at a mutual friend's housewarming party in Surulere, back when Emeka was still building his construction materials business out of a single rented warehouse space and a borrowed pickup truck, long before it grew into a modest empire of trucks and contracts it eventually became. He was not, in those early days, a smooth or particularly confident man. He spilled jollof rice on his own trousers trying to make conversation with me near the buffet table, apologized so many times that I eventually laughed and told him to stop before he apologized the flavor right out of the rice. We dated for 18 months before he proposed, at a small restaurant overlooking the lagoon in Victoria Island, nervous in a way that made me trust him completely, fumbling the ring box open so clumsily that it nearly fell into my water glass. I told him about my mother slowly over the course of that courtship, the way you reveal the most tender parts of your history only once you trust someone enough to hand them carefully. I told him about the diabetes, about the 11 years we spent managing it together, about the hospital room at Loth where she pressed her ring into my palm 3 weeks before she died. Emeka listened to all of it with what I believed at the time was genuine tenderness, holding my hand across whatever table we happened to be sitting at, telling me my mother sounded like a remarkable woman, promising, unprompted, that he would never let anything happen to something so precious to me. His own family welcomed me warmly, on the surface at least. His father, Chibueze, had passed 8 years before Emeka and I even met, so I never had the chance to know the man at the center of everything that would later unravel. His mother, Mama Nenna, was the only parent left to receive me into the family, and though I sensed a coolness in her from our very first meeting, I attributed it to, as most daughters-in-law eventually learn to the ordinary friction of a mother making room in her heart for the woman who now held her son's attention. I kept the ring in a small wooden jewelry box on my dresser, alongside my wedding jewelry and a few other pieces I had inherited over the years, and I checked on it more than I would like to admit. Not because I distrusted anyone in my household, but because grief has its own strange rituals, and mine involved opening that box so often just to see the ring still sitting there, still safe, still mine. Looking back now, there had been small things in the months before I found the box empty. Details I had explained away at the time with the same easy generosity every wife extends to a husband she has no reason yet to doubt. Emeka had started traveling to Onitsha more frequently than his business seemed to require, sometimes twice in a month, always returning with the same tired, slightly evasive energy of a man who had spent the weekend doing something other than inspecting cement deliveries. He had also become oddly protective of his phone in a way he never had been before, angling the screen away from me at the dinner table, stepping outside to take calls he would once have taken openly in the sitting room. I remember asking him lightly, almost teasingly, whether he was hiding a second family somewhere, the kind of wives make precisely because the real possibility feels too distant to seriously entertain. And I remember him laughing a bit too long before changing the subject to little Emeka's upcoming school resumption. There had also been a strange visit from Mama Nenna about 6 weeks before I discovered the ring missing. She had come to see little Emeka, as she often did, but this particular visit she had asked, almost casually, whether I still wore my mother's ring often, whether I kept it somewhere safe, whether I had ever considered having it appraised or reset into something more modern. At the time, I thought nothing of it beyond mild surprise that she had noticed the ring at all, since I rarely spoke of it to her directly. I understand now that the question had not been casual in the slightest. 6 weeks ago, I opened that box and found it empty. If you are new to this channel, welcome. And if you love stories that peel back layer after layer until nothing is what it first appeared to be, please subscribe now, because this story only gets more tangled from here, and I promise you, you will not see the ending coming. I did not panic immediately when I found the box empty. My first thought, foolish as it sounds now, was that I had simply misplaced it, moved it during one of my periodic reorganizations of the dresser, tucked it somewhere safer than I remembered. I searched every drawer in our bedroom. I searched my handbags, my old purses, the small safe we kept in the wardrobe for documents and cash. I searched with the particular growing dread of a person who already suspects, somewhere beneath the surface of her conscious mind, that the explanation she is hoping for is not the explanation she is going to find. I asked Emeka about it that evening, keeping my voice as light as I could manage, framing it as a casual question rather than the accusation it already felt like in my chest. He told me he had not seen it, that perhaps our house help, Patience, had moved it while cleaning, that I should ask her the next morning. I did ask her, and she looked at me with such genuine confusion that I believed her immediately. Patience had worked for us for 4 years then, and I had never once had reason to doubt her honesty about anything, down to the smallest naira she once found on the floor and placed carefully on my dresser, rather than pocketing it. For 2 weeks, the ring's disappearance sat in our house like an unspoken question, growing heavier with every day it remained unanswered. I searched again, more thoroughly, on a Saturday when Emeka had traveled to Onitsha for what he described as a supplier meeting for his construction materials business. I found nothing. I began against my own will to wonder whether I had somehow lost it myself, dropped it somewhere without noticing, misplaced my mother's final gift to me through nothing more sinister than my own carelessness. That thought alone kept me awake most nights, the guilt of it settling into my chest like a stone I could not put down. And then, on a Tuesday evening, scrolling through Instagram the way I do most nights before sleep, more out of habit than genuine interest, I saw the photograph. A woman I did not recognize, her hand extended toward the camera in the particular pose people use to show off jewelry, my mother's ring unmistakable on her finger, the small chip on the inner band catching the light exactly the way it always had in my own memory. The caption read, "Birthday gift from the man who sees me. Grateful doesn't even begin to cover it." I read it 3 times before the words fully registered. I zoomed in on the photograph until the image blurred at the edges, searching for any possibility that I was mistaken, that this was simply a similar ring, a coincidence, a cruel trick of memory and grief. But there was no mistaking it. I had looked at that ring nearly every day for 6 years. I knew every mark on it the way I knew the lines on my own mother's face. I clicked on the woman's profile with hands that had gone strangely, dangerously steady. The same stillness I have since learned settles over me whenever the ground beneath my life begins to shift. Her name was Wunmi. Her bio described her as an interior designer based in Lekki. Her photographs, scrolling back through months of posts, showed a life of quiet, curated comfort. Brunches, gym sessions, a small dog she clearly adored, and tucked among the ordinary content of an ordinary woman's ordinary online life. Several photographs I now recognize with a sinking clarity as having been taken in places my husband had traveled to for supplier meetings over the past year. I did not sleep at all that night. I lay beside Emeka, listening to his breathing, cataloging in my mind every business trip he had taken over the past year, every late evening he had explained away with a supplier's name I had never bothered to verify, every small, ordinary excuse a wife accepts without a second thought because she has no reason yet to look for a second meaning in it. By morning, I had a list of 9 separate trips, spanning almost 14 months, and I intended to check every single one of them against whatever evidence I could find. I began with our joint account statements, the ones we still used for household expenses, though I already suspected, correctly as it turned out, that whatever he was spending on Wunmi would not appear there. I found nothing unusual in that account, which told me only that he was disciplined enough to keep his deception financially separate from the life we shared on paper. I went looking instead through the drawer in his home office where he kept receipts for his business, fuel, cement deliveries, driver allowances, and buried among 3 months of ordinary paperwork, I found 2 hotel receipts from a boutique lodge in Lekki. Dated on weekends he had told me he was in Onitsha, inspecting a supplier's warehouse. I called my closest friend from secondary school, Chinelo, who now works as a pharmacist in Lagos and has known me long enough to hear the difference between my ordinary voice and the voice I use when something has gone quietly, catastrophically wrong. I told her everything I had found so far: the missing ring, the Instagram photograph, the hotel receipt that did not match the excuses I had been given. Chinelo, never one to soften a difficult truth for my comfort, told me exactly what she thought. Ngozi, you are already building a case the way you used to build spreadsheets for your old office job. Trust that instinct. Do not let him explain his way out of something before you have gathered everything you need to actually understand what you are dealing with. And whatever you do not confront him until you know the full shape of it, because men like to confess to the smallest possible version of their own guilt if you give them the chance. It was Chinelo who first suggested that the ring's disappearance and the affair, though clearly connected, might not be the whole story. That a man does not typically choose his dead mother-in-law's heirloom, of all the possessions available to him, as a gift for his mistress unless something more specific, more deliberate was tangled up in that particular choice. Ask yourself why the ring, not just why the affair. Why that ring specifically out of everything in your house? I did not yet have an answer to that question. It would take me nearly 2 more weeks and a long-distance phone call to my aunt in Enugu before I finally did. Before I tell you what I found when I confronted my husband, let me just say, if this story is already making your blood boil, wait until the middle, because the ring was never really about the ring, and by the time I understood what it actually represented, I understood something about my own marriage and my own mother that I had never once suspected in 6 years of grieving her. I did not confront Emeka that night. I have learned through experiences I will tell you about as this story unfolds that confrontation without complete evidence only gives a dishonest person time to construct a better lie. Instead, I did what I have always done when the numbers in my life stop adding up. I began quietly, methodically, gathering proof, because I needed to understand not just that my husband had betrayed me, but how deeply and for how long, and why out of every possession in our home, he had chosen to give this woman the one thing that could never, under any circumstances, be replaced. I want to pause here and tell you something about my own family, because it matters for everything that comes after. My mother, Chidima Okafor, was not a wealthy woman. She raised me largely alone after my father, Ozoimena Okafor, left our family when I was 9 years old, disappearing first into long stretches of absence and eventually into a full permanent departure that my mother never fully explained to me, not even as I grew into adulthood and began asking the more pointed questions a grown daughter is entitled to ask. All I knew growing up was that my father, in my mother's rare and careful words, had been a man who could not stay faithful to anything, not a woman, not a promise, not even his own children. She raised me on a teacher's salary in a modest flat in Enugu, and she wore that gold ring every single day despite the fact that we owned almost nothing else of value, as though the ring itself was proof that at least one promise somewhere in her life was once real. I always assumed my father had given her that ring in the early hopeful years of their marriage, before whatever unraveled between them began to unravel. I never once questioned this assumption. It was simply a fact of my childhood, as fixed and unremarkable as the color of the walls in our old flat. I would soon learn how wrong I had been, and how much of my mother's silence over the years had been protecting me from a truth far more complicated than a simple, ordinary abandonment. If you have been enjoying this story so far, please hit that subscribe button now, because everything I believed about my own mother's life was about to be turned completely upside down, and I promise you, the deepest layer of this story is not the one you are expecting. 3 days after I found the photograph, I called my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Auntie Ijoma, who still lives in Enugu and remains, even in her 70s, the sharpest memoried person in our entire extended family. I called her on a Sunday afternoon after church, when I knew she would be sitting in her small parlor with nothing more pressing to do than talk, the way she always was on Sundays. I asked her, carefully, gently, whether she remembered where my mother's ring had originally come from. I expected a simple answer: a wedding gift, an anniversary gift, some ordinary romantic milestone in a marriage that eventually failed. Instead, Auntie Ijoma went quiet on the phone for long enough that I asked if the call had dropped. "That ring did not come from your father," she said finally. "Your mother never told you this because she did not want you carrying her old pain the way she carried it for over 40 years. That ring came from a man named Chibueze Eze." I nearly dropped my phone. Eze, my husband's family name. Auntie Ijoma explained, slowly, reluctantly, as though she were finally setting down a weight she had carried far too long on my mother's behalf, that before my mother ever married my father, she had been engaged to a young man named Chibueze Eze. A man, my aunt said carefully, whom my mother had loved with the particular unguarded intensity of a first real love. She described my mother in those years before I was born as a livelier woman than I had ever known her to be, quicker to laugh, quicker to dance at family functions, a young school teacher with ambitions to eventually open her own primary school. She was a different person before that engagement ended, Auntie Ijoma said. I watched something in her go quiet after it, and it never fully came back, not even after she married your father, not even after you were born. Their families had already begun the traditional introduction process when Chibueze's family suddenly, without full explanation, called off the match. My mother was devastated, Auntie Ijoma said, in a way she never fully recovered from, though she rebuilt her life eventually and married my father within 2 years, a decision Auntie Ijoma always suspected was made more out of a need to move forward than out of any deep love for the man himself. Your father knew he was not her first choice, and my aunt added quietly. I have always wondered if that knowledge was part of what eventually drove him away from your family. A man does not always stay where he suspects he was only ever the second best option. The ring, it turned out, had been Chibueze's engagement gift to my mother, given during the courtship before the match was called off. My mother had kept it, not out of romantic sentiment for a man she had not seen in decades, Auntie Ijoma insisted, but as a private reminder to herself of a version of her own life that had been taken from her by a family who decided, for reasons never fully explained to her, that she was not good enough for their son. Chibueze Eze, I repeated slowly into the phone, my mind already racing ahead of my own understanding, connecting threads I did not yet want to connect. Auntie, is that Emeka's father? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything before Auntie Ojioma even confirmed it. This is exactly the kind of twist I promised you at the beginning, and if you are as stunned as I was sitting in my kitchen that night, please subscribe, because we are not even at the true climax of this story yet, and what I discovered next explained something about my mother-in-law that I had quietly suspected for years, without ever understanding why. I sat with this information for 2 full days before I said anything to anyone, turning it over in my mind, the way I once turned over columns of figures that refused to balance, searching for the logic that connected an old broken engagement from 40 decades ago to a missing ring on a stranger's finger on Instagram in the present day. The connection, when it finally came together for me, arrived with a coldness that settled into my bones and did not leave for weeks. My mother-in-law, Mama Nena Eze, had never particularly liked me. I had noticed it since the very first time Emeka brought me to meet his family, a subtle coolness in her greeting that never quite warmed even after years of dutiful visits, thoughtful gifts, and the eventual arrival of grandchildren she claimed to adore. I had always attributed this coolness to the ordinary friction between a mother and the woman who had taken her son's full attention, the universal, unremarkable tension every daughter-in-law learns to navigate. I understood now, sitting in my kitchen with Auntie Ojioma's revelation still echoing in my ears, that the coolness had never been ordinary at all. Mama Nena Eze was Chibueze's widow. My husband's mother had been married to the very man who had once been engaged to marry my own. Before his family, very possibly Mama Nena Eze herself, if she had already been part of that family's inner circle then, though I did not know the exact timeline, had called off the match and pushed him towards a different bride entirely. I called my husband that evening and asked him directly whether he knew that his mother had married a man who had once been engaged to marry mine. Emeka's silence on the phone was long enough that I knew, with the same cold certainty I had felt reading Chiamaka's caption weeks ago in an entirely different story that had once seemed unrelated to this one, that he already knew. He had known, in fact, for years. Ngozi, I need you to let me explain this in person, please, not over the phone. If you are still with me, thank you, because I promise the confrontation that followed was unlike anything I expected, and it revealed a secret my mother-in-law had been guarding for over 40 years. One she apparently had decided in the final months of my marriage unraveling to weaponize. Emeka came home early the next day, and we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had once believed our marriage was simply an ordinary, happy one, built on nothing more complicated than mutual love and reasonably compatible schedules. He told me everything, slowly, with the particular exhaustion of a man finally setting down a lie he had carried for longer than he wanted to admit. Before he even reached the part about the ring, he told me about Wunmi, how they had met at a design showroom 18 months ago when he was sourcing tiles for a client's building project, how what began as a professional acquaintance had slowly, over months of coincidental run-ins and eventually deliberate ones, become something else entirely. He did not try to dress it up as an accident he had stumbled into helplessly. I made choices at every stage, he said, staring at his own hands on the table rather than at me. I chose to text her back the second time. I chose to meet her for coffee the third time, knowing already it was not really about tiles. I am not going to sit here and tell you it happened to me. I did it, one small decision at a time, until the decisions became a whole separate life I was keeping running alongside our marriage. I asked him whether he loved her, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering, which told me more than any answer could have. I don't know what to call what I feel for her, he said finally. It is not nothing. I would be lying to you again if I said it was nothing, but it has never once in 18 months felt like what we have with you. It felt easier, in the way that things that have no real history and no real weight are always easier than the things you have actually built something with. My mother-in-law, Mama Nena Eze, had indeed been part of the Eze family circle when the engagement between his father and my mother was called off, though she had not been the one to make that decision. That had been his grandfather, Chibueze's father, who apparently disapproved of my mother's family for reasons rooted in an old complicated dispute between their two extended families that predated even the courtship itself. Something involved unpaid bride price obligations from an entirely different marriage 2 generations earlier. Tangled family debts that had nothing to do with my mother personally, but had made her, in the old man's eyes, an unsuitable match by association. Mama Nena had been introduced to Chibueze shortly afterward in what Emeka described as a hastily arranged replacement match, and though their own marriage had eventually grown into something genuine, Mama Nena had apparently known, because Chibueze himself had told her, in a rare moment of honesty early in their own marriage, that he had never fully stopped thinking about the woman his family had forced him to abandon. "When you and I started dating," Emeka said, staring at the table rather than at me, "my mother recognized your surname almost immediately. Okafor is not an uncommon name, but when you mentioned your mother had passed from diabetes and had raised you in Enugu, she put the pieces together within weeks. She never told me the full story until after we were already engaged ourselves. By then, I did not know what to do with the information except keep it from you, because I did not want you to feel like our own marriage was somehow shadowed by something that had nothing to do with either of us." "But it did have something to do with us," I said, my voice shaking now in a way I had been fighting to control since he began speaking. "It had everything to do with us, Emeka, and you decided that was your decision to make alone." He nodded, and for a moment I thought that might be the end of the confession, the full extent of what he had been hiding. But there was more. And this is where the story turns in a direction I genuinely did not see coming, even after everything I had already pieced together on my own. Please, if you have not already, subscribe now, because what my husband told me next connected the missing ring, my mother-in-law's decades of quiet coldness, and Wunmi's Instagram photograph into a single devastating picture that I am still, even now, trying to fully make peace with. "My mother found out about the ring," Emeka continued, "the same way you found out about it. She saw it in old photographs of your mother that I once showed her years ago, before either of us was married, trying to explain to her why I loved you and why the old family history shouldn't matter anymore. She recognized it immediately. She told me that day that it had been my father's engagement gift, the same ring he had given your mother before his own family forced him to abandon her. She was furious that you still had it, still wore it, still treated it as an ordinary piece of jewelry, when to her it represented an entire life her husband had once imagined with someone else." I asked him, my voice barely above a whisper by then, how the ring had ended up on Wunmi's finger. "My mother asked me to bring it to her," he said, "months ago. She said she wanted to see it one final time before she died, some closure with an old grief she had apparently never fully released, even after 40 years of a marriage that was by every outward measure a happy one. I took it from your jewelry box without telling you. I know now how unforgivable that was, but at the time I convinced myself it was a small thing, a temporary loan, that I would return it before you ever noticed it was gone." "And instead," I asked, though some cold, calculating part of me already suspected the answer before he gave it. "My mother never asked me to give it away," he said, and for the first time in the conversation, real anguish entered his voice. That part was mine alone to answer for. I had already been seeing Wunmi for 4 months by the time my mother asked for the ring. I do not have a clean explanation for why I gave it to her instead of returning it to you. I think somewhere in my own confusion, I told myself it was already tangled up with an old family betrayal, already somehow not fully yours to begin with, and that thought let me do something I know now was inexcusable. I am not asking you to understand it, I am only telling you the truth finally, all of it, because you deserve at least that much after everything I have taken from you." I sat in that kitchen for a long time after he finished speaking, turning the full shape of the story over in my mind. My mother's first engagement stolen, my mother-in-law's 40 decades of quiet resentment toward a rival she had never truly stopped comparing herself to, my husband's own affair tangling itself almost too neatly, almost too cruelly, around the exact same heirloom that had once symbolized his own father's broken promise to my mother. It was, I understood then, not simply a story of infidelity. It was a story of a single unresolved wound passed silently from one generation to the next, disguised each time in different clothing, until it finally arrived fully formed in my own jewelry box, on my own finger, in my own marriage. We are getting close to the resolution now, but before I tell you how I finally handled all of them, my husband, his mistress, and the mother-in-law who had, I would soon learn, played a far more active role in all of this than Emeka initially admitted. Let me just say, if this story has kept you as unsettled as it kept me, please subscribe, because there is one more twist waiting, and it involves a conversation with Mama Nena herself that I did not see coming. I drove to Mama Nena's house in Surulere 3 days later, alone, without telling Emeka I was going. I needed to hear the truth from the source itself, rather than filtered through my husband's guilt and his own incomplete understanding of his mother's motives. She received me in her sitting room with the same careful, formal courtesy she had always shown me, offering me a seat, offering me a drink, behaving for the first several minutes of our conversation as though nothing at all had shifted between us. She asked me about my job, about the traffic on my way over, about whether I had eaten, the same small rituals of hospitality she had performed at every visit across 6 years of marriage, and I let her perform them, watching her hands as she poured chilled zobo into a glass for me, waiting for the moment when the ordinary politeness would finally crack. I did not waste time on pleasantries beyond that first drink. I told her I knew about Chibueze and my mother, about the broken engagement, about the ring, and I asked her directly whether she knew when Emeka gave the ring to Wunmi exactly what he was doing and why. Mama Nena's face, for the first time in the 6 years I had known her, lost her careful composure entirely. She set her own glass down on the side table with a small deliberate click, and when she spoke, her voice had none of its usual measured warmth. "I asked my son for that ring because I wanted to hold it one more time," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I could not fully name, grief perhaps, or something closer to a very old, very tired anger. "Your mother took something from me that I spent 40 years pretending did not matter. Chibueze loved her first. He told me so more than once, in the quiet moments of our marriage when a man sometimes says things he should not say to his own wife. Do you know what it is to raise 3 children with a man, to nurse him through his final illness, to bury him yourself, and still, even standing over his casket, wonder whether some part of him was thinking of a woman he had not seen 40 years? I built an entire life with that man. I gave him everything I had. And still, somewhere underneath it all, I always felt like the arrangement his family settled on when their first choice was taken away. That is not my fault, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. And it is certainly not the fault of a ring, or me, or my mother, who never once in her entire life tried to take anything from you. She lost the man too, Mama. She lost him first, and she lost him more completely than you did, because she never even got the chance to build a life with him at all. Mama Nena was quiet for a long moment after that, and something in her posture seemed to deflate slightly, as though the fight had gone out of an argument she had been rehearsing for a very long time. No, she agreed finally. It was never the ring's fault. I understood that even as I asked Emeka to bring it to me. I told myself I only wanted to see it. I did not tell him to give it away.
Away, that decision was entirely his own, and when he told me what he had done, after the fact, not before, I confess I did not correct him firmly enough as I should have. Some small, ungenerous part of me was almost satisfied to see that ring finally leave your family a second time. I am not proud of that. I am telling you the truth because you deserve it. The same way, apparently, my son has finally decided you deserve it. I left her house that afternoon without forgiveness in my heart, but with something closer to understanding than I had walked in with. The recognition that Mama Nnena's coldness toward me across 6 years of marriage had never really been about me at all, but about a grief she had carried silently since before I was even born, a grief that had finally found its way through her son's own weakness into an act that had wounded me the way it had once wounded her. If you have made it this far, thank you, and please subscribe, because the ending of this story is not the clean, satisfying justice you might be hoping for, but I believe it is the honest one, and I think you will understand why by the time I finish telling it. I did not go after Wunmi directly, though I considered it more than once in the weeks following my conversation with Mama Nnena. I eventually messaged her, calmly, explaining exactly what the ring was and where it had come from, my mother's broken engagement to Emeka's own father, the 40 years of silence, the small chip on the inner band that had witnessed 2 generations of women's private grief. I did not write to shame her. By then, I no longer believed, if I ever truly had, that she had known the ring's full history when she accepted it as a birthday gift from a man she had no reason to distrust. I needed her to understand what she was wearing on her finger every time she photographed it for the world to see, because I did not think she could possibly want to keep wearing it once she knew. She responded within a few hours, and her message surprised me with how little defensiveness it contained. She wrote that she had ended things with Emeka the same week she received my message, not entirely because of the ring itself, she admitted, but because learning its history had forced her to finally reckon with the fact that she had spent 18 months building something with a man who kept an entire family, an entire life, carefully hidden from her, the same way he kept parts of that life hidden from me. I did not know, she wrote. I am sorry for the part I played, even unknowingly. This was never mine to keep. Within a week, a small courier package arrived at my door containing the ring itself, along with that short note, and I have not heard from her since, though I understand through the same quiet channels of mutual acquaintance that tell you everything in Lagos that she has since moved her design business out to Ibadan, choosing perhaps to build the next chapter of her life somewhere far enough away to start over cleanly. Holding my mother's ring again, back in my own palm after 6 weeks of believing it lost forever, I cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since the day of her funeral. It was not simply relief at recovering an object, though that relief was real. It was something closer to finally understanding my mother fully, not just as the woman who raised me alone on a teacher's salary, but as a young woman who once loved deeply, lost that love to circumstances entirely outside her control, and carried the quiet weight of that loss every single day for the rest of her life, disguised as ordinary jewelry, disguised as an ordinary, unremarkable ring. Emeka and I separated 3 months after that conversation in Mama Nnena's sitting room. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I have to offer you after everything I have shared. I did not leave him purely because of the affair, though the affair alone would have been reason enough for many women, and I do not judge anyone who would have walked away at that point alone. I left because I understood finally that Emeka had inherited his own family's quiet, well-intentioned deception, his father's broken promise, his mother's 40 years of unspoken resentment, his own decision to remove my mother's ring from our home without telling me. All of it built from the same instinct to manage difficult truths in secret rather than face them honestly together with the people those truths actually belonged to. I could not build the rest of my life on top of a pattern that had already caused 2 generations of women, including my own mother, so much quiet, unspoken grief. telling our son, Chukwuemeka, whom we call Little Emeka to distinguish him from his father, was the hardest part of the entire ordeal. He was 5 years old at the time, too young to understand any of the specifics, but old enough to notice that his father's clothes had slowly begun to disappear from our shared wardrobe, that dinner had become a table set for 2 instead of 3 several nights a week. I told him only what a 5-year-old needed to know, that Daddy would be living somewhere else now, that Daddy still loved him very much, and that none of it was anything he had done or could have prevented. He asked me once, with the particular directness children seem capable of, whether I still loved Mama Enena, his grandmother, and I told him yes, in the complicated way grown-ups sometimes love people who have also hurt them, which is not a lie, though it is certainly not the whole truth either. We finalized our separation quietly, without the drama of courtrooms or public accusations, dividing what we had built together over 6 years with a fairness that surprised even me, given everything that came before it. Emeka moved into a flat of his own in Yaba, close enough that he still sees Hetul Emeka every weekend without fail, a consistency I have come to respect, even as I have struggled to fully forgive him for everything else. I kept the house, and more importantly, I kept my mother's ring, which I now wear every single day, exactly the way she once did, a small chip on the inner band catching the light in a way that no longer reminds me only of loss, but also, finally, of everything she survived to give me. I think about my mother often now, more than I did even in the early years after her death, wondering what she would say if she could see everything her old ring set into motion. A granddaughter's marriage, an old rival's quiet grief, a truth finally dragged into the light after 40 decades buried beneath careful family silence. I think she would tell me, in the same steady voice she used the day she pressed that ring in my palm in her hospital bed, that a woman should always own one thing in this world that no man gave her and no man can take away, and that sometimes the hardest part of owning it is simply refusing to let it disappear quietly, the way she once let so much of her own life disappear quietly, into silence, into pride, into a grief she carried completely alone for 40 years so that I would never have to carry it with her.
Little Emeka is 7 now, old enough to ask more pointed questions than he could at 5. And I have promised myself that when he is finally old enough to understand the whole story, I will tell him everything. Not to poison him against his father or his grandmother, but because I believe, now more than ever, that silence is the one inheritance I refuse to pass down. My mother protected me from her own pain for my entire childhood, believing she was sparing me a burden, and in some ways she was. But I have come to believe there is a difference between sparing a child unnecessary pain and simply delaying an inevitable reckoning by one more generation. I would rather my son grow up knowing the full, complicated truth of where he comes from than discover it one day, the way I did, through a stranger's photograph on a stranger's Instagram page. If there is a lesson in everything I have told you today, it is this. The objects our mothers leave behind are rarely just objects. They are the last unfinished sentences of lives we never fully got to hear the whole story of. And sometimes, if we are patient enough, if we are brave enough to keep asking questions even when the answers frighten us, those objects finally tell us the rest. Thank you for staying with me through every layer of this story, from that first photograph on a stranger's Instagram page to everything buried underneath it. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me to live through it, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be uncovered. More women whose quiet, ordinary lives turned out to be hiding entire histories none of us ever expected. And I would be honored to share the next one with you.